In this comic book is a love story, a boy and girl in love. They get married, and after an offensively lurid description, illustrated, of course, of the couple's wedding night, the book shows how the bride murders her husband by chopping his head off with an axe. This comic book describes a sexual aberration so shocking that I couldn't mention even the scientific term on television. I think there ought to be a law against them.
Hello and welcome. 1954 was a very significant period in comic book history. It's the year the anti-comics crusade reached its peak, and the industry was forcibly calcified, preventing this new medium from expanding beyond the limitations set upon it by public misconception. To begin with, in March of 1954, there was a report by the New York Legislative Committee that examined the publication of comic books. In essence, this report concluded that comic books had a significant influence on children. In April, the most remembered event of this period occurred, the publication of the book, The Seduction of the Innocent, by Dr. Fredric Wertham. This book took the position that comic books contributed to juvenile delinquency, a common concern for parents at the time. He further suggested that some comic books also acted as manuals to teach children how to commit crimes. Neither these claims, nor many other claims within that book, were supported by anything resembling empirical data. 2 days after the publication of this book, a Senate subcommittee held hearings on juvenile delinquency. 3 days of testimony were focused directly on comic books. Dr. Fredric Wertham, EC publisher William Gaines, and the famous artists Walt Kelly and Milton Caniff all testified before this subcommittee. Finally, in October, the censorship board, the Comics Code Authority, was established by the major comic book publishers of the era. This was in response to the fear that if the comic book industry didn't censor itself, the government would do it for them. This was a reasonable concern, and the Comics Code had the desired effect. The Senate subcommittee noted the formation of the Comics Code Authority in its report the following year, and it did not suggest government intervention in the regulation of comic books. However, this year-long series of significant events didn't just spontaneously happen. It was preceded by almost 15 years of anti-comic rhetoric in the form of opinion pieces and highly suspect studies into the effects of comic books on children.
Well, what about the effect of these comic books on the children?
All of our testimony from psychiatrists and children themselves show that it's very upsetting, that it has a bad moral effect, and that it is directly responsible for a substantial amount of juvenile delinquency and child crime.
The earliest example of the anti-comics crusade was an editorial written by Sterling North, a literary critic for the Chicago Daily News. This editorial, titled A National Disgrace, became quite popular and was reportedly reprinted all across America. Describing this editorial doesn't do it justice. I have to read directly from it. Quote, "Virtually every child in America is reading color comic magazines, a poisonous mushroom growth of the last 2 years. 10 million copies of these sex horror serials are sold every month. $1 million are taken from the pockets of America's children in exchange for graphic insanity. Frankly, we were not perturbed when we first heard about the rise of the action comics. We imagined, as most parents do, that they were no worse than the funnies in the newspapers. But a careful examination of the 108 periodicals now on the stands shocked us into activity. At least 70% of the total were of a nature no respectable newspaper would think of accepting. Save for a scattering of more or less innocuous gag comics and some reprints of newspaper strips, we found the bulk of these lurid publications depend for their appeal upon mayhem, murder, torture, and abduction, often with a child as a victim. Superman heroics, voluptuous females in scanty attire, blazing machine guns, hooded justice, and cheap political propaganda were found to be on almost every page." Unquote. This editorial was originally published on May 8, 1940, which was only 2 years after the comic book medium gained widespread popularity with the publication of Action Comics #1. Somehow, within those 2 years, a medium that was still discovering its own voice had managed to destroy the youth of America. That's so metal. The inflammatory language aside, it did one very subtle and highly influential thing. It falsely suggested that comic books were exclusively intended for children. Certainly, comic books were popular with the young ones, but so were movies, radio, and the equally new medium, television. All of these mediums had content specifically for children. However, no one would suggest that any of those other forms of entertainment were exclusively for children, so the basis for this argument was clearly untenable. This false equivocation would be repeated so many times, it was practically accepted as fact by the general public. This misperception was the stigma the medium wouldn't overcome until the end of the century. In stark contrast to the misperceptions previously noted, there were actual academic studies during this time that analyzed the effects of comics on children. These studies basically found nothing to suggest that comic books either negatively or positively influenced a child's comprehension or social skills. They were just, a popular form of entertainment. In other words, comic books were simply a new medium that had widespread appeal with young ones. This caused their parents to be concerned for no reason other than the fact that they couldn't understand why their kids were fascinated with these crude, four-color oddities. This is a pretty understandable but generic reaction. Historically speaking, an older generation is always perplexed and distrustful of anything a younger generation finds interesting. The various genres of music being a prime example, or video games, or cell phones. There were some working in the comic book industry that addressed the concerns of the critics. However, it wasn't a concerted effort by all the various companies. So, in the end, this defense of the medium was, at best, half-hearted and completely ignored by the public. In 1948, more articles and opinion pieces would start to appear in a variety of magazines. There was, for lack of a better metaphor, an outbreak of anti-comic rhetoric. Even the American Journal of Psychotherapy held a symposium expressing concern about the influence of comic books. During this year, rallies to burn stacks of comic books were arranged and publicized. Mostly, but not exclusively, the comics burned were either horror or crime comics. It was at this point that Dr. Fredric Wertham began to emerge as the alleged authority on the topic of comic books and their influence. On March 27, 1948, Collier's magazine would publish the article, Horror in the Nursery. The primary source of information was Dr. Wertham himself. Basically, this article is Dr. Wertham's blueprint argument against the comics medium. They were violent, overly sexualized, and he cited cases where children were influenced by what they had read in comic books. It's an argument he would repeat in the article he wrote for the Saturday Review of Literature on May 29, 1948. And again, 5 years later, in November of 1953, Dr. Wertham would repeat this argument in an article for the Ladies' Home Journal. The following year, Seduction of the Innocent would be published, and Dr. Wertham would become, at that point, the de facto figurehead for the anti-comics crusade.
When I was a boy and played with the gang, we did a lot of things. We roasted potatoes, went on expeditions, we tipped over garbage cans now and then, we wrote nasty remarks about the teacher on the sidewalk. But we never spent an afternoon sitting around like this, reading.
To be fair to Dr. Wertham, he did appear to have a genuine concern about the effects of sex, violence, and racism on developing young minds. After all, a significant portion of his career was spent trying to identify and treat the factors that led to violence and crime. And, continuing in the vein of fairness, there were no shortage of lurid comic books available to feed that predisposition. The only thing missing, the only important factor one might suggest, is the fact that there was no verifiable connection between these lurid comics and the hot-button topic of juvenile delinquency. The anecdotal evidence Dr. Wertham compiled and used to argue that a link existed was, basically, suspect, and in some instances, partially fabricated or conflated. The point being, none of the evidence Dr. Wertham claimed to have compiled for Seduction of the Innocent would have withstood an objective peer review. Therefore, his work wasn't science. It was opinion. And since he held a doctorate, his opinion was upheld as fact by those who were predisposed to believe comic books were evil. Moreover, those working in the comic book industry were forced to respond to this position. With public opinion overwhelmingly against them, and with the government considering regulating them, comic book publishers and distributors established the Comics Code Authority. This censorship board would ensure that the medium remained sanitary and infantilized for the next 15 years. Thus, the popular misconception, which was established in 1940, that comic books were a medium exclusively produced for children, was cemented in public opinion. Following the events of 1954, the comic book industry dramatically changed. During this time, many publishers simply stopped producing comic books. Most couldn't or wouldn't adapt to the strict censorship guidelines being enforced, EC being the most notable example. By 1960, there was only a handful of comic book publishers left. Most had diversified their content as much as possible in order to appeal to the widest possible audience. Two genres were highly unrepresented: crime and horror. Both of these genres were the main target of both the Seduction of the Innocent and the Comics Code Authority, so they were avoided by the publishers that survived this era. To give you a perspective of the effect the preceding events had on the comic book industry, one only needs to examine the number of companies that existed before and after 1954. By my account, there were roughly 20 comic book publishers that existed prior to the Anti-Comics Crusade and the implementation of the Comics Code. Between 1954 and 1958, 12 of those companies went out of business or stopped publishing comics. This mostly occurred in 1955 and 1956. 2 more companies would go out of business in the 60s. So out of the original 20 companies that published comics, merely 6 managed to survive the anti-comics movement, only 3 of which exist to this day.
Legislation against unfit comic books is possible. Legislation that won't interfere with the rights of a free press.
It is not without some irony that the death of the Comics Code Authority in 2010 coincides with Dr. Wertham's notes and research being made available by the Library of Congress. Of course, within this material was all the clinical evidence Dr. Wertham had used to write Seduction of the Innocent. One researcher, Tilley, examined passages from Seduction of the Innocent with the evidence Dr. Wertham had used to support his claims. Ms. Tilley, who later published her findings, discovered that the discrepancies between the book and the clinical research were quite numerous. This discovery was not all that surprising to anyone familiar with this topic. In the decades since its publication, Seduction of the Innocent was often criticized and maligned for presenting a factual case against comics without providing any actual facts. The book was generally considered a sensationalized, intentionally misleading argument that attempted to link a popular trend, comic books, with a popular concern, juvenile delinquency. However, like Seduction of the Innocent itself, criticism without proof is merely unsubstantiated opinion. The release of Dr. Wertham's notes and the subsequent research done by Ms. Tilley validated the years of criticism the book had received. There are many examples where Dr. Wertham omitted or added to what was related to him by his subjects. In some cases, he attributed statements from one person to another person or persons, and vice versa. In other words, he manipulated statements and edited out contradictions to support the claims his book was making. Furthermore, he apparently included second-hand information provided to him by contemporaries and by parents without independently verifying its authenticity. Overall, Seduction of the Innocent is a case study in how to falsify evidence to strengthen a position not supported by fact. In the end, the only positive thing that can be said about the Anti-Comics Crusade and Seduction of the Innocent is that it proves that a popular opinion is not evidence of a controversial phenomenon. One can talk loudly and often and gather others to your cause, but a consensus doesn't make one's opinion valid. It simply means you've created a remarkably convenient lie that you and others willingly choose to believe. That's it for today. Like, share, subscribe, and comment, and I will talk at you later. Until next time.